This is your presentation about value and shading with pencil. The lesson objectives are to demonstrate the ability to create value by shading with different types of pencils, to demonstrate the technique of creating smooth transitions of value using various tools for blending and shading, and to apply various shading and blending methods to create different areas of values of gray. And eventually you're going to complete a 10-step value scale using a pencil and blending tools. We are starting with some important vocabulary. Value. Value is the lightness and darkness of a color. For this unit, we are focusing on black and white and gray. So why do artists use shading in their artwork? One reason is to produce the illusion of form, 3 dimensions, and depth. Remember, depth is how close and far away something is, as well as we use shading to create contrast and realism of the forms. Shading, showing the change from light to dark on an object by darkening areas and leaving other areas light. So there are 2 methods for shading. There's side shading and point shading. Now, both of these examples look pretty similar, but they've been shaded in different ways. For side shading, it appears grainier on the paper with a softer look, and it covers a large area more quickly. So sometimes we have to shade something really big. So to do it more quickly, we would shade with the side of the pencil. When we use point shading, this allows you more control, the ability to add detail, and get a greater range of tone out of that pencil. This just means we can get really dark and really light using the pencil because we have more control due to the way that we're holding it. So when side shading with a pencil, we're just holding our pencil more like this, and we're just literally shading with the side. This allows us to cover a bigger area more quickly. For point shading, this is where you're using more of the point of your pencil. So for example, here's a cylinder. The light source is coming from this direction, so it's going to be darker on this side. So if I'm shading, because I have a smaller area that I need to shade, I'm going to use the point of my pencil. Plus I can turn it, and I have way more control in where I am adding those areas of value. If I use side shading for this, I'm going to be using way too much pencil, and I might actually make too much of a mess using the graphite. Now you're going to start using different types of pencils. You should already have an HB pencil. This is your regular yellow pencil. We use this for writing and drawing, but you'll also have access to B pencils. These are pencils that have a softer lead. You can create darker tones of gray. We do have H pencils. The lead is harder and more precise, but we don't really use H pencils in shading. So the way to think of it, H is hard. B is more like butter. That's how I think of the B, or black. And because the higher the B, the more buttery and spreadable that lead is. So the higher the H, the harder the lead is. Please do not put the B pencils in the electric pencil sharpener, especially those ebony pencils, because the lead is so soft, it'll buzz down in a second and you really won't have much pencil to use. So what is contour pencil shading? This is where you have shading that uses directional shading to follow the contours of the form. And this, though, allows you, your shading, but allows you to create a sense of 3-dimension.
So for this part, make sure you view the actual image in the slideshow, but how you're going to shade it is you can go a couple ways. But what we're going to do is we're just going to recreate the areas of value. We are just shading, we are not blending yet. So as you can see, this side here, again, I'm looking at the photo reference, this side is going to be a lot darker. It's definitely a lot darker on this side here. And then this middle is actually going to have some shading, but make sure you're following the contours of the forms.
So when you're shading, we want to avoid pressing hard. Instead of pressing hard with your pencil, we want to layer more and more graphite on the paper gradually. Also, the key is to keeping your pencil marks even and close together. If you spread them out, the shading is much more uneven. So to shade dark, instead of just pushing really hard with your pencil, you need to just shade using layers of graphite. Just layer more and more. So I'm going to put a bunch of graphite on here, but now I want to make that darker. So I'm going to use more and more layering on top. Now, if you want to try using a 6B pencil, put even more layers of graphite on top. And look how much darker that lead is, because again, a 6B has softer lead. Now, if you want lighter values with pencil, we need to use a light pressure with the pencil. Now, to shade lightly with your pencil, we just want to use a light pressure, as if you are touching butterfly wings, right? Just use light pressure. Butterfly wings. We're not going to layer this graphite because we want to keep it light. And when you are shading, it's a good idea to work from light to dark, because if you start really dark, it can be difficult to erase because the pencil graphite literally imprints itself into the fibers of the paper, and then it's harder to erase. But at the same time, don't be afraid to go dark with your values eventually. We want to make sure you have the darkest shadows, because then you can adjust the rest of your values accordingly, right? Like this shading looks fantastic here on this face, but that's because there are areas that are significantly dark versus the lighter areas. Blending. This is the process of getting rid of lines. Now we have a contour drawing here, and notice it is made of lines. But when we use good shading, we actually get rid of the outlines. So the trick with shading is to no longer rely on outlines to show the form. We want to shade right to the edge of those lines so they actually look like objects and no longer a coloring book page. You have a new tool to use, blending stumps. So what is a blending stump? It is a tightly rolled up paper. It's used to smudge or blend light values of graphite. And what this means is you just have to work a little less hard at shading, because now you have this blending stump to blend everything together. Now the larger blending stumps are called blending stumps. Smaller blending stumps are actually called tortillons, but I call them blending stumps anyways. So you can see the difference. Here's just the shaded pencil, and here it is where they started blending it with the blending stump. Then we're going to take our blending stump. Yours is going to be cleaner than mine because it's new, but when we blend, we do not use the tip. This is not a pencil. This is just a piece of tightly rolled up piece of paper. So you actually use the side of it when you're blending. And I like to move back and forth when I'm blending with the blending stump. I also like to use little circles, and you really don't need a lot of pressure when you're using a blending stump. Now, if you try to blend where there's no pencil, you'll notice it's really abrasive and it doesn't blend very well. That graphite is actually just being carried over from the blending stump onto the paper. But when you're shading, you can then apply more graphite on the paper and then blend it even more. Question: how do we clean our blending stumps? So your blending stump is going to get dirty at some point. How do you clean it? We need to get a piece of sandpaper, and we're going to take this and pull it along the surface, and that gets rid of some of the graphite. It will not make your blending stump completely clean again. And make sure you're not just doing it this way. If you decide to sand the top of your blending stump, it's going to flatten down and you won't have one that works anymore. When we are blending, we no longer want to use our finger. Why? Because our finger contains oils, and those oils will interact with the graphite on the paper, and that will affect your shading and blending. So do not use your finger anymore. Another new tool is a smudgy. This is a folded paper towel used to blend medium to light values of pencil shading. So a smudgy is made using part of a paper towel. So you'll need to go grab a paper towel, and you just need a little bit. And to use this, we're actually going to fold the paper towel into kind of like a triangle, because then you can put your finger right here and actually smudge the graphite. So we're going to put some graphite here on our paper, medium pressure, and I'm going to take my smudgy and just smudge it. And I like to use little circles. This is easier for larger areas of graphite. Blending stump is better for smaller areas, and of course we can layer more graphite on top, and we can just keep on smudging that graphite. Now sometimes you might need to change out your smudgy. You can always get a new one, you can make a new one, and you just, that's how we're smudging the graphite. So no longer with a finger. Now you're also going to be using a kneaded eraser. This is really to lighten areas that are too dark or to reclaim highlights. And what's cool about a kneaded eraser is you can form it into different shapes, into different forms, depending on where you need to use it. And what's nice about with a kneaded eraser is you don't get those yucky eraser bits all over your table. It's actually much more clean and easier to use. Now, when you're shading, we really want to avoid smudging our artwork by accident because that makes our work look much more dirty. So we want to use a hand blot. This is a piece of scrap paper placed under your hand. Just like you see here in this photo, I'm shading this dark area. And so by using a hand blot, it helps keep the artwork and your hand clean and free of pencil smudges. That means you don't have to go back in later and try to erase all the pencil smudges. Our next word is contrast. In shading, this is used by showing the difference between very light and very dark areas. As you can see in here, why do we use contrast? This is really to make objects stand out from a background and to show the difference between shapes and edges, right? With this background being so dark, these edges here stand out. And even down here, there's contrast. You can see contrast here in these grapes, right? The grapes look darker. They look more closer to us versus the grapes that are lighter and they look farther away. Now, this is an example of what happens when you do shading, but you really don't use any contrast. Everything looks kind of flat and kind of boring. Gradation. This is a gradual change or slow blend from dark to light. There should be no jumps in value, and you can see an example of gradation here. It also relates to value scale. This is a series of values of shading from 1 white to 10, which is an ebony pencil. That is the darkest lead that we have. It's always important to have a value scale so you can understand how dark and how light you can make your art medium. Light source. This is direction from where the light originates or comes from. So when we add value using shading, we always have to consider the light source. Where is the light coming from? Because that affects everything in the artwork. It's going to affect the shadow, it's going to affect the darkest area and the lightest area.
So to complete this part of your worksheet, you're going to need a pencil. You'll need a pencil for shading. You're going to need your blending stump. You may want some sandpaper to clean it off at some point. You could use a smudgy if you want. You may not need one though, but you'll definitely want a kneaded eraser. And so what you're doing is you are literally copying the areas of value. I know the picture looks a little more grainy, but we're going to make this area dark to light in this direction, and you can see how the areas of dark and light change. So how to get that started. So we definitely want to go pretty dark, and then you can see as you keep shading, it'll get lighter in this area. So we want to make sure we stay within the lines, that we're going to be neat with our shading. You can always rotate your paper, like it might be a little easier. But at some point, once you have enough value on your paper, you can actually go in and start blending those areas of value using your blending stump. But make sure we're cleaning up our edges, and you're going to go back in and do a bit more shading. I'm going to tackle this corner here. And so that's all you're doing. You're going to definitely look at the photo reference to copy the areas of value. And we're looking for a nice, smooth shading.